Haven Arrest Missionary Baptist Church Sunday School Lesson number 4, Sunday, March 25th, 2018. The lesson is entitled Seeking His Face. The lesson comes from 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verses 12 through 22. We were asked to read the same. The place is Jerusalem. The time is 9:59 BC. As we begin to study this passage, including the wonderful 2 Chronicles 7:14, which is so often quoted in connection with the promise of God's answer to our prayers, it is well to remember the title of the lesson, Seeking His Face. There is a scriptural concept of God turning away His face from those who displease Him. The idea is that He no longer listens to their prayers and no longer blesses them with health, prosperity, and safety from enemies and disasters. It may also indicate that He might not be actively bringing them under His correction and discipline. This is not as bad as God forsaking someone, but that action on God's part is a very serious call to repent of sin and cry out to God for forgiveness and mercy. There are consequences to ignoring God or misusing our relationship with Him. Our task as teachers is to inform and alert our students to the dangers of such behavior without causing fear or undue distress. Today's aim: facts, to understand God's statement about seeking His face. Principle: to seek God's face as we should, so we will be blessed. Application: to make it a daily practice to seek God's face. Illustrating the lesson: God promises to hear and answer prayer made in His way. Practical points. 1. We should pray that God dwells in our congregation. 2 Chronicles 7:12. 2. God's response to sin and disobedience is inevitable destruction. Verse 13. 3. God responds to earnest prayer and repentance with forgiveness and healing. Verse 14. 4. God will abide in people who are dedicated to Him. Verse 15. 5. God's people are a source of refuge and peace. Verse 16. 6. We bring blessings or destructions upon ourselves based on whether we obey God or not. Verses 17 through 22. Golden text. If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. 2 Chronicles 7:14. Today we have 2 lesson outlines. The first is the blessings of seeking God's face. 2 Chronicles 7:12 through 18. The second is the consequences of not seeking God's face. 2 Chronicles 7:19 through 22. Introduction. Think of all the kinds of advisors people go to for counsel and direction. People seek out friends, talk show hosts, advice columnists, financial consultants, counselors, and psychiatrists. Even Christians seek out these kinds of people sometimes. Seeking help from other people, especially trusted friends and counselors, is not wrong. God intends that we help one another. Sometimes, however, we are so concerned about seeking other people that we forget to seek the Lord. Our present study focuses on seeking the Lord, 2 Chronicles 7:14. This concept is so crucial that we find a reference to it more than 20 times in the Old Testament. For example, Psalms 105:4 exhorts, "Seek the Lord and His strength, seek His face evermore." What is seeking the Lord? It involves following after Him and His way when we face a decision or problem. Our text in this study directs us to seek God's face, which adds a personal element to this instruction. The blessings of seeking God's face. 2 Chronicles 7:12. And the Lord appeared to Solomon by night and said unto him, I have heard thy prayer and have chosen this place to myself for an house of sacrifice. Verse 13. If I shut up heaven that there be no rain, or if I command the locusts to devour the land, or if I send pestilence among my people. Verse 14. If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven, and will forgive their sin, and will heal their land. Verse 15. Now mine eyes shall be open, and my ears attent unto the prayer that is made in this place. Verse 16. For now have I chosen and sanctified this house, that my name may be there forever, and mine eyes and my heart shall be there perpetually. Verse 17. And as for thee, if thou wilt walk before me as David thy father walked, and do according to all that I have commanded thee, and shalt observe my statutes and my judgments. Verse 18. Then will I establish the throne of thy kingdom, according as I have covenanted with David thy father, saying, there shall not fail thee a man to be ruler in Israel. 2 Chronicles 7:12 through 22 follows the typical way an ancient Near Eastern covenant was structured by listing the blessings for compliance. Verse 12 through 18, and the consequences for disobedience. Verse 19 through 22. Deuteronomy 27 through 28 is another example of this kind of structure. First, we note the blessings for obedience, or in this case, seeking God's face. The Lord's appearance. 2 Chronicles 7:12. This verse states that God appeared to Solomon at night. It was the second time God had appeared to him. The first appearance is recorded in 2 Chronicles 1:7. In that night did God appear unto Solomon and said unto him, ask what I shall give thee. That had taken place soon after the king's accession to the throne. These appearances raise two questions. How did God appear to Solomon, and why were both times at night? The Lord may have appeared in a theophany, temporarily taking on human form, but perhaps more likely he simply gave some visible indication of his presence as he talked to Solomon. Maybe these two appearances were similar to the Lord's appearance to Samuel, where the Lord came and stood and called as at other times. 1 Samuel 3:10. No matter how the Lord manifested himself, we can be sure that Solomon recognized it was the Lord who appeared to him. Interestingly, both appearances occurred at night, as was the case also with Solomon. 1 Samuel 3:3 through 10. Perhaps God chose the nighttime so that Solomon could give his full attention to the Lord. Even today, the Lord often brings thoughts to our minds in the still of the night when other matters are not clamoring for our attention. In this appearance, the Lord assured Solomon that he had heard his prayer and accepted what he had done. 2 Chronicles 6:12 through 42. He also affirmed that the temple was the special place of his presence and the only place for offering sacrifices. The Lord's remedy for judgment. 2 Chronicles 7:13 through 14. In these verses, the Lord set out a scenario of potential judgment and then told Solomon what to do if that judgment were to come. The potential judgment would be the Lord withholding rain, sending locusts to devour the land, and inflicting disease among the people because of their sin. These were not purely hypothetical consequences. Viewed even on just a human level, the outlined disasters were quite probable in light of the people's history of disobedience. Even though judgment was likely, the Lord encouraged Solomon by outlining for him the remedy for the judgment. The remedy involved the people humbling themselves, praying, seeking the Lord's face, and turning from their wicked ways. If the Israelites took these steps, God promised he would hear them, forgive their sin, and heal their land. The ideal of healing their land probably conveyed restoration, which could mean restoring the abundance of the land or even restoring them to the land itself, as was the case after the exile. 2 Chronicles 7:14 is sometimes used by pastors and Christian politicians to explain how we can turn a country back to the Lord. This verse certainly shows the principle that God will restore in response to obedience, but we need to be careful about applying it to the United States or to any other country. God made this promise specifically to his covenant nation, the Israelites. This verse is not a promise to Christians or to whatever contemporary nation they live in. We should try to influence the spiritual direction of our country, but we should be careful of applying this promise directly to us. One of the steps the Israelites were to take was to seek the Lord's face. This was an anthropomorphic expression, that is, one that speaks of divine realities in human terms. Seeking the Lord's face is essentially the same as seeking his presence. The Hebrew word for face can be translated as presence, because seeing someone's face means being in that person's presence. While the promise of 2 Chronicles 7:14 was made to Israel, today we should still seek the Lord's face or his presence in a personal and intimate relationship. We need to live so close to the Lord that we have a conscious awareness of his presence in our lives. We should have such a close relationship with him that it is like looking in his face. David exhorted us to seek the Lord and his strength, seek his face continually. 1 Chronicles 16:11. Blessings to Israel. 2 Chronicles 7:15 through 16. If Israel fulfilled the requirements of verse 14 and sought the Lord's face, God said he would respond in two ways. First, he would respond favorably to their prayers, verse 15. Again, using anthropomorphic expressions, the Lord said his eyes would be open and his ears attentive to the cries of his people. Second, God said he would place his name, his eyes, and his heart in the temple which he had chosen and sanctified. Each of these three things is significant. God's name stands for who he is, his character and being. God's eyes convey the idea that he will always look out for his people. He will always give them his full attention. God's heart speaks of his deep concern and care for his people. Furthermore, God's name, eyes, and heart would be in the temple unceasingly, indicating his constancy toward his people. Blessings to Solomon. 2 Chronicles 7:17 through 18. In addition to the blessings that would come to the nation, God also promised a specific blessing to Solomon if he continued to seek God's face and did everything God asked of him, just as his father David had done. The specific blessing promised to Solomon was the establishment of his throne and the perpetuation of his dynasty. This promise to David is first recorded in 2 Samuel 7, where Nathan told David what God would do. I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Verses 12 through 13. Furthermore, the Lord said through Nathan, and thine house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee. Thy throne shall be established forever. Verse 16. This promise is repeated in 1 Kings 2:4 and 2 Chronicles 6:16. The unconditional promise, known as the Davidic covenant, has never been abrogated and is the basis of the premillennial position that Jesus Christ will someday rule from the throne of David in the millennium. If the promise is unconditional, why does 2 Chronicles 7:17 seem to indicate the promise is based on Solomon's obedience? The answer seems to be along these lines. The promise is unconditional, but the enjoyment of it by Solomon or any succeeding king would be based on his obedience to the Lord. The consequences of not seeking God's face. Verse 19. But if ye turn away and forsake my statutes and my commandments, which I have set before you, and shall go and serve other gods and worship them. Verse 20. Then will I pluck them up by the roots out of my land which I have given them, and this house which I have sanctified for my name will I cast out of my sight, and will make it to be a proverb and a byword among all nations. Verse 21. And this house which is high shall be an astonishment to every one that passes by it, so that he shall say, why have the Lord done thus unto this land and unto this house? Verse 22. And it shall be answered, because they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, which brought them forth out of the land of Egypt, and laid hold on other gods, and worshipped them, and served them. Therefore have he brought all this evil upon them. Falling away. 2 Chronicles 7:19. In keeping with the structure of ancient Near Eastern treaties, the Lord next delineated the consequences of disobedience. The specific disobedience here was going after other gods and not seeking the Lord's face. Sadly, that was exactly what Solomon and most of the succeeding kings did. They forsook the Lord and followed the false gods of the nations around them. Solomon himself went after many false gods. In 1 Kings 11:5, 7 through 8 we read, for Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zordanians, and after Malcolm, the abomination of the Ammonites. Then did Solomon build an high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, in the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. And likewise did he for all his strange wives, which burnt incense and sacrificed unto their gods. God told Solomon that if he followed other gods, he would suffer dire consequences. Removal from the land. 2 Chronicles 7:28. Employing an agrarian term the Israelites would understand, God said that just as a plant is plucked out of the ground, so he would pluck them up by the roots and remove them from the land he had given them. This also was exactly what happened to the Israelites when they were exiled from the land of Assyria and Babylon. 2 Kings 17, 5 through 23, 2 Chronicles 36, 15 through 21. Destruction of the temple. 2 Chronicles 7, 20b through 22. Not only would the people be exiled to foreign lands, but the beautiful temple Solomon had just made and dedicated would be destroyed as well. The Lord said he would reject it and make it to be a proverb and a byword among all nations. To say that the temple would be a proverb and a byword means it would become an object of contempt. People everywhere would point to it as a sorry example or illustration of what sin had done. The later history of Israel shows that such destruction did take place. We find in 2 Kings 25, 9 through 10, that Nebuchadnezzar burnt the house of the Lord and the king's house and all the houses of Jerusalem, and every great man's house burnt he with fire. And all the army of the Chaldeans that were with the captain of the guard break down the walls of Jerusalem round about. The destruction of the temple would be so complete that people would walk past its ruins, would be astonished and say, why have the Lord done thus unto this land and unto this house? 2 Chronicles 7:21. God told Solomon that those people would find a ready answer to their question. They would know that the destruction was because the people laid hold on other gods and worshiped them and served them. Verse 22. Solomon and his people started well. Solomon made a dedicated and dwelling place for the Lord. The people obeyed by offering sacrifices and keeping the prescribed feast. They had sufficient instructions to seek the Lord's face and warning of what would happen if they did not do so. Sadly, however, Solomon did not remain faithful to the Lord as had his father David. He lapsed into disobedience, and his influence on the people led them into sin. After generations of disobedience, the people eventually lost their land and their temple, and because they did not seek the face of the Lord. Earlier in this study, we said the Hebrew word for face can be translated presence. Because seeing someone's face means being in that person's presence, we conclude that seeking the Lord's face is to be equated with seeking his face, with seeking his presence. So what is involved in seeking the face or the presence of the Lord? In one sense, we are always in the Lord's presence by virtue of his omnipresence and his indwelling, but seeking his presence is something more. Seeking the face of God requires that we act intentionally. We have to make an effort to seek his presence. Where do we find God's presence and how do we enter it? Hebrews 4:16 invites us to come boldly unto the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. This passage indicates that we can come to the place where the Lord dwells, the place where he is present. How do we come to that place? By prayer. Our times of prayer usher us into the very throne room of God. Without being mystical, perhaps we should think consciously about how our prayer time brings us into the place where God himself dwells. Before we ask, maybe we should spend time in reflection and meditation, just as if we were sitting in his presence. Once we are in his presence, we can ask him what he wants us to do and what his plan is for our lives. Let us recommit to making our prayer times more than reciting a list or hurrying through our prayers to get to the next part of our busy life. Let us enter into the presence of God and seek his face to guide our lives. Questions. 1. What were the Israelites to do when they faced difficulty? 2. Why does 2 Chronicles 7:14 not apply directly to Christians today? 3. What anthropomorphic expression did we find in this verse and what does it mean? 4. What is conveyed by the mention of God's eyes, ears, and name? Verses 15 through 16. 5. What promise did God make to Solomon? 6. What false gods did Solomon end up following? 7. What would happen to the people if they turned from God? 8. What would happen to the temple if the people turned from God? 9. In what way would the temple become a proverb and a byword? Verse 20. 10. How do we seek the Lord's face in our lives today? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, March 25th, 2018. Thank you for listening. God bless.